Paper Cut Club on Oman FM.
Hello and welcome to the Paper Cut Club, a show where we discover a little bit more about the world and ourselves through the magic of the written word. I'm your host, Fatma Makki. My guest today is my friend Ammar and Naimi, a writer and...
A writer. I think that's it. My name is Ammar Naimi and I do wordy word stories and that's it basically.
Okay. Ammar is joining us today, fueled by coffee and rage.
Yeah, I won't even say rage. Like I consider myself the sort of person that tries not to get too opinionated. Mm-hmm. Like I want to assume the best.
Yes.
This time it was a little tough.
It's okay. We want that. I'm actually actively encouraging this.
So what are we talking about?
We're talking about craft in the real world, rethinking fiction writing and workshopping by Matthew Salesses. So the reason why I brought this book up for us to talk about was because just to give you some background, I read this amazing review on this book by one of the book bloggers that I follow and really admire, who's on Instagram, Kiki from If This Is Paradise. And I was very intrigued by it. I felt like it was potentially relevant for us. So I suggested to you, and you being a writer, I was particularly intrigued about your opinions on this, and I thought it would be great for us to have a discussion about this from your perspective as a writer and my perspective as a very avid reader.
All right. Should I start by just saying kind of how I feel?
Yeah. Go ahead.
I gave this book, just today, I gave this book 3.5 stars out of 5 on Goodreads. And it is because it is one of those books that I have, while reading it, I just kind of didn't like some parts. And I just kept turning the audio off and going no, I disagree. And then turning it back on. I would just have imaginary arguments with the author. But at the end of the day, it opened my eyes to some things. And I think that's important. It's going to be one of those books that I kind of keep thinking about for the next maybe 5 years.
Nice.
And I think that's ultimately a good thing. And part of the blame is on me because when you recommended the book to me, I didn't go do any research. I just said, Fatma likes it, download. That's it. So I went in blind, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah. What did you think, first of all?
Well, first of all, I'm really glad you're being honest because I on purpose didn't give you a lot of context and background because I did want your unfiltered opinion. And so for that reason, I didn't tell you to ask you to do any research, and I'm glad you didn't in advance because you came with a very fresh perspective, and that's kind of important. For me, as a reader, this was incredibly helpful to give me the context, for me to understand what goes into writing a book makes a lot of difference for me when it comes to me opening it up and reading it. It helps makes some things clear. It helps point me towards the questions that I maybe should be asking more of.
Yeah, because you're not reading something that exists in a vacuum. You're
Exactly.
reading something written by a human being with their own stuff.
Exactly. So, for example, one of the things that he mentions, writing is doesn't necessarily have to rely on relatability of a character or whatever. And this is something that I've definitely been sort of guilty of in the past when I've looked at books and didn't like the book for whatever reason. I would say, oh, this book is not relatable. But anyways, all of these things, we're getting too heavily into the discussion. And before we even get into that, I want to set the scene. Craft in the Real World was described by Moroccan-American author Leila Lalami as a significant contribution to discussions of the art of fiction and a necessary challenge to received views about whose stories are told, how they are told, and for whom they are intended. The traditional writing workshop was established with a particular subset of writers in mind. What we call craft is informed by their cultural values. In this bold and original examination of elements of writing and aspects of workshop, Matthew Salesses asks questions to invigorate these familiar concepts. He upends Western notions of how a story must progress. How can we rethink craft and the teaching of it to better reach writers with diverse backgrounds? How can we invite diverse storytelling traditions into literary spaces? So, before we even begin the discussion on the main points, discussions of main topics of craft, I want to address the main question for us, which is how is this even relevant to to writing or reading in Oman or in the Arab world.
Have I ever told you about how I learned English?
No.
So I went into a private school when I was maybe 11, 12, 5th grade, 6th grade.
Yeah.
And my English was so terrible that my English teacher said, oh no, we need to fix this. And so her strategy was, let's give him stories. And so I start with these tiny stories and I read them. And prior to that, I'd only ever read Magellat Magid, Kalila and Dumna, all that sort of classic stuff.
In Arabic. Yeah.
And so I started reading these stories in English, and I transitioned from like the stories for kids for middle grade, and then to the Harry Potters, and then to the Northern Compass and all of that. And so suddenly 5 years go by, and like I am completely immersed in the American British novel. And that's how I learned English. And that feeds into then me becoming a writer. But see, I am a 28-year-old Omani man living in the GCC. And I mostly read books from that region of the world right now.
Exactly.
And so if it happens that those books have a specific expectation or culture or specific tricks and skills and all of that, it impacts me immensely. And I know other people who just they read these books. And so I think it's good to know where it comes from. Just to clarify, when I said that part of the world, I meant the Western part of the world.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, when I go into bookstores here in Oman, if I'm looking for books in English, I won't really necessarily find, I'll give you an example. I rely on Saqi Books in London. Saqi Books is a bookstore and a publishing house that based in London that specializes in Middle Eastern and Islamic writing. And I rely on their account and a number of other accounts based in the US or in the UK to give me information about writing and reading from this part of the world. I won't go into a bookstore here and find books written by Arab authors and translated into English unless it's a very small, very already commercially successful subset of fiction, like Sabat Tahir, for example.
Yeah.
Or Jokh al-Harthi now. And even now, Jokh al-Harthi is not that easy to find here.
Yeah.
So,
It's only the one book, right? That you find sometimes.
Exactly. And so my point is that we definitely get influenced by whatever writing traditions are established and proliferate from the US or from other Western countries, because that's what's available here. This is what most people are consuming and subconsciously learning from. You know?
Yeah. I mean, we get influenced so much that when we read something that doesn't adhere to we have created a mold in our head that's based on those books. When we read something different, we go like, why does it do this? Why does it makes no sense to us? And
Exactly.
That's because we're used to one thing.
And also, this really comes into greater relief when you actually acknowledge the fact that we, as you mentioned, we are in the GCC. So to give an example of that, when I was in high school here in our Arabic class, one of our in our textbook, we had one of Ernest Hemingway's short stories, The Old Man and the Sea, probably one of his most famous ones, translated into Arabic and published in our textbook. And we were supposed to be reading this as an example of outstanding literary achievement in translation. And I still to this day don't really understand why that particular text was chosen.
I've read it twice. I don't get the fuss.
Yeah. I mean, this is generally the sentiment that I hear outside of the US on Ernest Hemingway.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, he is kind of held up as this, the pinnacle of literary achievement in Western tradition. And Matthew Salesi's actually addresses this in the book, is that his style of writing, his very formal and subdued style of writing, which focuses mainly on the physical and what is obvious, and where his sentences are very restrained,
Yeah.
and clipped.
Yeah, and
you
then
know?
you have to try and figure out that the newspaper with the baseball on it is a metaphor for
Exactly.
the emotional states. What?
Exactly.
I don't know anything about baseball.
Exactly. So there's a lot of symbolism. There's a lot of reference to only the physical, not really much exploration of the internal state of the characters and things like that. So all of these types of features or characteristics of Ernest Hemingway's writing and other writers of that era suddenly became seen as the ideal form, and for a long time that informed the way in which creative writing was actually taught, and aspiring authors, a lot of aspiring authors tried to emulate that style. And so going back to me sitting in Arabic class here, reading the story in translation, I was like, I don't know if this is a good story, because it was translated into Arabic. And I think a lot of first of all, none of that tradition carried over into the Arabic. The fact that this is something that's established in short story writing or in writing in general, it doesn't really carry across, because this style of writing is like the opposite of what Arabic literature actually is. I mean, probably
contrast that with Du'a al-Karawan or Rijal Taht al-Shams or Shajarat al-Ablab. It just like goes into the emotions way more clearly.
Way more.
They're like, no, this person is sad and he will collapse now. Observe.
And in a very poetic way, oftentimes, and with a huge emphasis on emotions. I mean, Arabic writing is often very emotional and very very intense emotions as well at that. And I think that comes from the tradition, the Arabic tradition of poetry writing, which has a lot of hyperbole and very descriptive metaphors and similes and things like that.
Yeah.
So all of these reasons are why I thought it is relevant to talk about these things, because when you do end up in situations like this, when you're reading a story like Old Man and the Sea, intended with a different audience, like a young Arab audience, for example, it might make the Arab audience a little bit confused. Like, why is this supposed to be good, actually?
Yeah.
And so understanding that background can do something.
Is this to say that there's something wrong with the Western traditions or current?
No, I don't think so. So I actually think I think it just. I'll give an example of. I'll illustrate this using a metaphor. Fittingly enough, the metaphor is the pantheon of Greek gods. They have all of these types of gods, and someone is going to come and say, Zeus is the best god. You know what I mean? Because he's, I don't know, all powerful or whatever. I clearly don't know much about Greek.
Obviously, the best Greek god is Iron Man. It makes sense.
And that's his name too.
Yeah.
And then someone might come and say, no, I think Athena is the best god, but actually they're all gods in their own right. They all have their own powers and characteristics and weaknesses and virtues. But this is just one of many. And I think that maybe like what Matthew Salesius is trying to explain in the book is that Western literary tradition is not necessarily the goal, but that doesn't mean that it should be discarded. It definitely shouldn't be discarded, because there's a lot of value that you get out of it, and a lot of amazing works that I personally love.
Okay, can I use this to lead into what I didn't like?
Yeah, please.
All right, what I didn't like about the book is that it seemed to imply that there is no universal goodness.
That's true.
That there's no universal threshold of what makes something good, and it's completely based on what culture you come from. And the way he illustrates that is that, well, if you, hypothetically, you come from a culture where the best story is the story where there are 3 lines going horizontally, and then a poem, and then a tree shows up and saves the day, right? Or you come from a tradition where Deus ex machina, where something unexpected happens, is the best. If you go from that culture and you come read a an average Western novel, you would say, this is nonsense, I don't like it. And that's the metaphor that he brings to the table. I would argue that no, there are there are at least some things that we can agree on. You know, there has to be some stuff that we can agree on. That like, this is good, this is nice, this is aesthetic from a writing standpoint, from a story standpoint, from whatever. And I just could not get over this issue. Like whatever he said, I would say, I agree, but remember what you said 30 pages ago?
Okay, so, you know, he even drills down to the point of words like ask and said.
Yes.
You know, to exemplify just how, in his opinion, non-universal some things are.
That's such a better example than what I tried. Please go ahead.
And I think he did that on purpose to just simplify, you know, the complexity of this topic, which is, and I think this all speaks to his view that we should now discard the idea of pure craft and universal values, because he doesn't believe in such a thing as pure craft, which tends to isolate the writing away from the writer and their lived experience. And the other thing he mentioned was the fact that he doesn't believe in anything called universal values. A huge part of the book, which is very important to understand before being able to engage with the rest of it, is because he's talking about the Western literary tradition. It's commonly accepted that the Iowa Writers' Workshop is an MFA program that was actually the first, according to his research, according to his assertion, it was the first creative writing program that actually formalized the art of creative, or the craft of creative writing. It was established in the 1930s in Iowa.
I would argue that's probably the moment where workshopping became the woe that it is now.
Exactly.
It's like something that professional writers do.
Exactly. So they actually built this tradition of creating these workshops, which is basically a group of student authors sitting with a writing teacher and sharing each other's creative output and critiquing it in a very rigorous, sort of structured way. And I've heard about this workshopping technique before, but I didn't realize until listening to this book how rigorous it actually was. Apparently there's these rules that you have to follow where, you know, writers all share each other's notes, and then when the one writer is getting critiqued, they're not allowed to speak. They have to just listen to all the critique and then only maybe have a chance to respond later at the end. And, you know, he has a lot of critiques about the way in which workshop is conducted, and that's definitely a huge part of this book. But for the purposes of this discussion, I want to mainly focus on the actual craft of writing and how it impacts people from different diverse backgrounds. But I did think it was important to mention this Iowa Writers' Workshop because the main contention that he has is when it was founded, one of the directors early on in the life of the Iowa Writers' Workshop was a man called Peter Engel, who headed the place in the 1940s. And he tried to fundraise for this workshop to make it the thing that it is now. And one of the main aspects of his fundraising goal was to instill the values of American freedom and independence. And so there are a certain set of values that he proclaims to be universal, and which Matthew Salesses is now saying, no, these are technically not universal. These are American specific. And you can see that in the contrast between writing that comes out of the US versus writing that comes out from, let's say, China, which is one of the examples he uses very frequently because he is Asian American. Do you even agree with this assumption? Like, are the values of freedom and independence, are they universal?
No, they're American specific. That's where I agree with the author. And like I would go so far as to say that craft can change, and there are techniques that would work differently based on where you come from. A beautiful example that he brought in was the Western insistence on the 3-act structure. I actually did a sort of, I don't want to say workshop.
Now that word is so loaded.
Yeah, now that workshops are so formal, I don't want to say that I did a workshop because
I did a shop of work.
I did a shop of work a week ago at the creative festival, where I actually talked to them. It was about short stories, and I told them that this is what we call the 3-act structure. It was formalized in French plays and Italian, all sorts of things, and it became a part of the novel. And the way it works is based on conflict. Act 1. The conflict is about to start. Part 2, there is a conflict between what the character wants and what the world wants.
Yes.
Conflict 3, in the third act, the conflict is resolved, the world changes, and the character changes. Or they fail to change. And during that, I told them, guys, this is not the only way to write. However, when people become accustomed to a certain thing, and when a theory becomes so easy to implement in reality, like you can take a memory from your life and you go like, oh, that's Act 1, that's Act 2, that's Act 3. It has value. It has intrinsic value. Like you can take that structure and put it within an otherwise Chinese construct and it would work, right?
Okay.
The same way that the Chinese 4-act structure would work if you did it properly.
True.
So I think that there is a universal goodness in craft that you have to be very artistic in learning how to use.
So in your view, the universal value that we can all potentially rely on as writers or as readers and analyzing that work is the value of technique. So, okay. But that speaks more to, I think, technique rather than values, because, for example, as he mentioned in the book, the value of freedom is something that's highly prized, and individuality and human agency.
Yes.
This is something that he goes on about. And actually, what I enjoyed about this book was that he was speaking. He didn't shy away from using his personal lived experience, which is something that academics, I find, tend not to do.
It's terrifying.
It's scary because you're putting yourself in a very vulnerable place. And also, it goes against the academic tradition of depersonalizing your work. And he's kind of going against that by making it very personal and saying that what you're teaching and what you're learning, it doesn't exist in these ivory towers just in universities and writing workshops. This craft is getting translated and disseminated across real people, and they're being created by real people. And that all affects how the writing is received and how it should be created. And I appreciated that. One thing that I related to so much in what he was saying was when he was talking about again, plots which rely a lot on human agency. And that's, the human desire to see a certain change is what drives the plot. And of course, that's very relevant to a lot of forms of writing and a lot of genres.
Yeah. Here's like where we would go back into the Greek god thing. Because apparently what he argues is that this goes back to, is it Plato?
Aristotle. Yeah.
Aristotle really didn't like how much the stories of his time relied on Greek mythology, because what would happen is this character would just be alive, and then Zeus shows up and the farm gets destroyed because of the thunder, and then he needs wisdom, and so Athena comes and grants him some wisdom. And so Aristotle just really hated this.
Yes, because everything was externally caused. Yes.
So they came up with this entire tradition that relies not on the external world, but rather on what happens. And now, see, this is like where I would agree with the book, because let's like take away the cultural weightage and significance. Let's take that all away. How fun would it be to mix the two? To have the agency, like Terry Pratchett does this, or he used to do it. He passed away. Terry Pratchett created this fantasy world where in the disc world, the gods were just real. And so if you were an atheist, the gods would come and throw rocks at your window and break it. And so just playing around with all of these concepts, the strength of the character and how you change the world versus how sometimes it would rain if you're sad, And I think being able to play with all of this, to read as widely as possible, gather these techniques, and then have your own style.
Yeah.
Or your own maybe cultural medley.
Yeah.
I think that's the way to do it.
I do think so. And I think that, even readers intuitively know if they make enough investment to really examine their own thoughts about a book that they're reading, they'll intuitively know when something is not of their understanding or exists outside of the world of their values. So like the reason why I mentioned this example was he talked about how he was so enamored as a child by stories where the protagonist was had, what he described as vast, incomprehensible powers, and was able to basically tap into these powers and access these magical worlds. Like, I think he was talking about Narnia in particular, and he was just enthralled with these stories, and that was that literally unlocked something in my brain for me, because as a child, I realized all of the books that I loved to read so much, they were all American and British writing. And I loved these books, like specifically to this day, one of the books that I don't know why, it's just such a comfort read for me. It's called What Katy Did, and it's a child's book by, I think her name was Suzanne Coolidge. Definitely her last name was Coolidge. And it was about this young girl who was like, living in the prairie or whatever in the U.S. And she, was very capricious young child and strong-willed and all of that. And she fell from the roof because she was playing on the roof, and she broke her leg or got really injured. And the whole story is just about her going through this injury and being like, bedridden for so long, and then not knowing if she was going to be able to walk again. And then through her sheer force of will and motivation basically the story is just basically her physical therapy journey, and like learning to walk again and stuff like that. And for me, that was such a powerful story as a child, because it was about this girl who was very determined, very patient, very enterprising and strong-willed and independent. And these are the types of stories that are very prevalent in Western literary tradition, especially for children. And that's not a bad thing. Again, I'm saying when we question these things, it's not to say this is bad and this is good, but this is what it is,
Yeah,
and
it's a lovely story. By the
it's
way.
a great story. I still have it actually in my mom's house. And then other ones are like the Enid Blyton series of stories, where there are always these. Enid Blyton was a woman writer in the 40s, I think, in the UK, and she wrote all these great stories about young kids who were like gangs of friends who would go off to adventures, like they'd go and take over a deserted island and make their own community or whatever, or Roald Dahl stories. These are all examples of books which don't really come from the culture that I came from, but they were so impactful to me, and 100% they shaped part of my psyche in a way, and I think it's really valuable to know these things, because this helps to sort of, even for people who are not writers, just readers, to understand what are the things what are the messages, the cultural messages that I've absorbed. Are these messages that I actually want? And in this particular case, I'm lucky, because these are all cultural messages that I'm happy to take on, because I consider them to be good. But maybe in other cultures it might be less, less acceptable, because there's a lot of, there's a lot of different cultures and a lot of different messages that can be shared.
Here's the thing, Fatma. Recently, I have started to almost do a tour of reading. And I think this started in 2020, where basically I initially started by just reading one book per author. So I would read like one Stephen King book, one Neil Gaiman book, one Terry Pratchett book, etc., 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 just to get exposed. And then I transitioned, like more books by West African writers, more books by Asian writers, and so on and so forth. And sometimes it would obviously, like I would be able to see the different cultural tradition that they're using, that they're leaning on. The African ones, for example, it was so heavy on mythology and spirits, and the ancestry was just like, ancestry was a character in those stories. And I think this book gives me more of an appreciation for different cultures of storytelling and how they can be integrated in like a very smooth and just sort of subtle way, almost to get people from across the world to be able to interact with them. Like, like baby steps, basically. That's
very valid, yeah, and very true, because actually, if you remember, the last time when we recorded it for Sodom, for our Sodom episode, I was telling you that I was in the middle of reading a book by Ben Okri, who's a Nigerian writer. And the book was called The Famished Road, and it's considered one of the classics of West African fiction or contemporary classics. And while, I was interested and I was engaged with the book, but because of the high level of, I don't know how to say this, but because of the fact that it was so deeply steeped in West African literary tradition, and I had no experience of that tradition whatsoever, I found it very difficult to wade through. And that's not on Ben Okri, that's on me, because I'm not the intended audience.
But were you able, here's my question, were you able to recognize that he does something amazing that you're not able to wrap yourself around?
Yes, exactly. One thing that I knew what he was doing was incredible, because first of all, the book was focused on spirits and the fantastical in a way that I haven't seen before. First of all, his level of creativity and imagination when coming up with these spirits, because in this world that he creates, the characters, the real life protagonists, live alongside spirits and ghouls and monsters, essentially, pretty much like it's normal, almost. And that's how in the world of this book, that's how it's accepted. And I've seen that idea being shown in other books before, but the way he does it is different, because on every page, his description of the child walking into a room in a house and seeing, the different types of spirits that he creates, they all look very ghoulish. Like there's one guy whose legs are like go all the way up to the top of the roof or whatever, right. And then he has a teeny torso, and it's just very imaginative stuff, and each page is crammed with them. And I was,
this reminds me of a character I just created that's like this genie that's 3/4 nose. I think I actually told you about this. This was before I wrote the book, but during our last podcast, I was telling you about this idea.
No way.
It's an actual character now. Like, the torso goes up to here, and there's like this much nose, just going straight up. Yeah.
I love that. But yeah, that would have been a Ben Okri writer, like a
this
character.
Is not to take away from Ben Okri, please. Ben, if you're listening, I know how incredible you are.
Imagine he was listening.
Ben, come on,
that would be
man.
amazing.
I'm so sorry.
No, but my point is, you're right that learning about these things, these areas in which we can get context for the book is so helpful, because if I was less interested in analyzing the book, I would just dismiss it as not good, because it's not something I'm used to.
Yeah.
And I think that's the really important point, that just because it's something we don't understand, because we don't have that in our culture, that doesn't mean that it's not great. You know?
And it goes beyond like fantasy or magic elements. It goes all the way to how important is the parent characters in the story, right? In cultures where parents are the people who impact your life, then you would see the main character do whatever they can to make their parents happy. And so I'm pretty sure that a Western person will say, why? Why is this character not taking agency for their own life?
Exactly.
And it's like, no, because it's from a different culture where family comes first.
Yeah. And the importance that you place on your parents' wishes is way higher maybe than in other places. Yeah. I also want to talk about Iowa conventions. So Iowa, the Iowa's Writers Workshop, which I just explained, Matthew Salaces mentions that lists a number of axioms or conventions that were developed through the life of the Iowa Writers Workshop. And some of these are very classic examples of things that I've heard about even as a reader. I've even commented on these things for the purpose of reviewing other books, that, this book doesn't do this, doesn't abide by these conventions, and therefore I don't consider it to be a good one. And some of these conventions are things like show, don't tell, kill your darlings, and write what you know. And I never realized that these were from a particular Western tradition. Like, do you consider these to be things that you, as a writer, try to follow?
Yeah, and I would argue that not all of them are purely Western. Like show don't tell, it's also existent in Russian, a specific type of classic Russian literature. There's like this thing, I'm trying to actually pull up the quote now. Oh yeah, don't tell me the moon is shining, show me the glint of light on broken glass. This is something if I had a penny for every time I saw this on a blog post, I would have like 15 pennies probably.
But do you think that's valid? I mean, like that books all have to be like this?
No, but I think it's a powerful tool to use. Like I don't think that there is any specific, and like this is maybe the thing that I learned, or maybe this is another axiom from Western thought. I learned from the people who I read that there is no one big rule to writing. And so whenever I see a thing like this, I would go like, oh, that's interesting. Let me shelf that somewhere and use it as one of the tools.
Okay.
But as like a hard do this, don't do that, I do not think that any person should really follow any specific tradition.
I think this is the benefit, I don't know if you agree, of you not having you're self-taught. You've taught yourself everything you know.
True, that's true.
You know, you haven't put yourself through this
Well, I just wanted to say something about pulling myself by the bootstraps and all that, but it's just a joke.
That's a very U.S. thought as well.
It is, yeah, it is.
But you know, people who do go into creative writing, let's say they decide to enroll in an MFA program.
Yeah.
Who they were at the start might be very different from who they are in the end. And, you know, maybe this is one of the good things about being self-taught, is that you're not beholden to any of these particular rules. You are able to absorb them, like you're aware of them and you've learned about them because you're self-taught, but you're not like thinking to yourself, oh, this is actually, I think, probably something that's an issue in general in academia.
Probably. And like I think you make a very good point. Like I am not the representative of all writers. And just like going back to just Twitter in my head, I can definitely remember people complaining about things that they learned during either writing school or art school or whatever it was, and them finding out later that they were forced to conform, which is not cool. Just not cool.
Yeah. Well, what about things like when it comes to coming up with structure for a story? So structure is probably one of the things that's most heavily taught in workshops and in creative writing classes, courses.
Yeah.
And I think the way in which he described structure was very different from how I, as a reader, see it. You know, you kind of touched on it a little bit when you're discussing like 3-act structure versus 4-act structure.
Yeah, it's such like a different world of like it's such a deep art form to get into. So I will say I haven't exactly figured out structures yet. I think, you know, that's why people come up with rules, aslan, because it's so hard if you just try to do it.
Yeah.
I noticed this when I try to exchange stories with my nephews and nieces. Like I will give them like a simple story, they get it, and then they go like, Ami, I want to tell you a story. And then they go, there was a strawberry, the strawberry got very big, and then he got happy at the end. I'm like, that's not a story. That is not a story.
Fail.
Of course, I don't say that, but like you can, it's difficult to actually come up with a proper structure. And I think that's part of the reason why they came up with all of these frameworks for people to follow.
Yeah.
But they're supposed to be guidelines, I think.
I think so too. But I do think it never occurred to me until reading this section or listening to it, how much structure can actually impact the way in which a story is told, which I know sounds so obvious to you as a writer, but to me as a reader, it just kind of blew my mind a little bit. And it also took me back again to stories where the structure was something that I had an issue with, not just the structure, but the way in which it was told. So just to give an example again, so he talks about structures and explains that and really breaks it down as not just the structure of the way in which you tell the story. So the way in which a part of a story, the parts of the story appear within the story, i.e. the structure of the actual story itself, is important because it informs the reader about what they should know and when they should know it, obviously. And different ways of ordering the same pieces of information are supposed to tell you things in different ways and give you different feelings, I guess. So one example for me...
There are so many eye-opening things in this book. Like things that I've kind of used 20% of, but never really figured out. And he goes, oh, when you describe a scene, one of the rules that Western culture uses is describe the familiar and then gloss over it,
Yeah.
highlight the unfamiliar, and then make the familiar unfamiliar. He gives an example, and I'm like, oh my God, this is something I do, and I didn't even notice, and I was
Yeah.
doing it wrong, for example.
That's awesome.
And yeah, I think it's the same for structure, and that's the thing that
Yeah.
you were mentioning. How do people actually interact with that as readers is very important.
Yes, and that's what I'm coming to now. Like how I interact. This came up for me, and in one story a book that I tried to read but decided to put down, possibly, and I think this comes down to literally the structure and what it said about the book and the author and the implied reader. So this book is called Union Atlantic by a writer called Adam Haslett. I didn't know anything about this writer or the book, but this is so random, but I was in a secondhand bookstore in Munich, and the owner of that store was an American guy, and I was like chatting with him, and he said, I really recommend this book. It's fantastic. It's all about, I remember exactly even the term that he used. I love a bit of financial skullduggery, so it's all about like, I don't know, white collar criminals or something.
Yeah.
And so I picked it up, and years later, I actually opened it as
we do, yeah.
as you do. And I was really not happy with the way that the prologue started, and I decided to put it down because the story is about the financial crisis and the way in which people reacted to it. But the prologue was about the protagonist who was in the Gulf during the Gulf War, and he was a U.S. Soldier stationed in Bahrain.
Oh.
And already that put me, in opposition to the writer.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
My hackles are just like...
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then the next thing was he used the example of the Iran Air Flight 655, which was a disaster that happened in the 80s, where a commercial plane was shot down and everyone on the plane died.
Really?
Yeah, this is real. Okay. And so he used that story as a plot point. And, so the soldier was going into this dukkan, like a little shop, buying cigarettes. And the shopkeeper was listening to this news story on his radio or on the TV. And when he saw the soldier coming in, he got upset because, he was like, you're the cause for all of this kind of thing, and started yelling at him. And then the protagonist, was kind of rude to him in response because he was trying to hide his guilt. And then he left. And then that was the prologue. And then it moved on to New York, circa 2003 or whatever. And at that point, I put the book down, and I was like, I had a physical and emotional reaction to that prologue, because I was like, he literally just used this story as a prop, and he used the setting of Bahrain and the Bahraini guy as a prop to propel the story of the protagonist and show what kind of character, which obviously most times setting and other characters are used in that way. But this was the first time it really just became clear to me somehow just how tokenized these types of characters are, and it upset me. And I thought, I'm clearly not the intended audience for this book. This book was not, meant for me to be read. And it doesn't mean that I shouldn't be reading it, but it's clearly not meant for me. It's meant for someone else, maybe an American reader who might sympathize with, the plight of the soldier who feels bad, that he's being attacked because of something, else that he didn't actually do, blah, blah, blah. And I am seeing it from a totally different perspective.
Yeah.
And I make the choice to keep reading the book. And I contemplated it because my past self would have been like, this is all in the interest of learning different viewpoints and being able to read about different perspectives and open your mind and blah. And then I thought, okay, but on the other side, ignoring this physical and emotional reaction that I had and this aversion I had to the way in which the story was treated is kind of like a violence against myself, almost. And I don't want to necessarily subject myself that today. I don't feel like I have the emotional fortitude for that. So I put the book down, and I was like, this is one of the first times I was like, it's justified not to finish the book, because for me, I always have to finish a book.
Yeah, and it might really, really, really highlight something else that maybe this book was trying to do that I didn't really see or I didn't notice, which is that if you follow a specific, and you just accept a specific the Western cultural ideal to writing and novels and all of that. What this means is that we, as readers, must conform.
Exactly.
We must change our tastes to just like get with it. Like,
Yeah.
you know? Yeah.
Just get your head in the game.
Just get used to it,
Yeah,
you know?
exactly.
And I think perhaps the opposite is key. And this is what I maybe disagree with the initial premise of the book. The book and the thing that you mentioned at the start of this episode by the author
Lalami.
She speaks of how we must accept and let people in order to give them a space to tell their own stories. I believe that she is talking about the Western publishing industry opening the path to people from other cultures. And my response is, why would I want to write there? You know, like it would be so much better if every single country has its own publishing thriving scene and they create their own techniques and their own tools and their own entire industries. And then we can like mix and share.
That's true. And on that note, do you feel there is something of a tradition coming up in the Arab world or the GCC that you can point to that could indicate like a sort of custom, a literary custom here?
My vision on this is unclear. I don't really know. I can see more people writing. I can see more people trying. However, is that something that's sort of coming from what we're used to reading, or does it come from our own culture and our own traditions? I don't know, and I think it's a bit too early to tell. Like I pulled for you today a study that I found by Sultan Qaboos University, and it is by Mrs. Aida Fuad Nablawi, and she went through the effort of finding these folk tales from Bahla and gathering them and sort of discussing them and how they work. And there's like this part here that I want to tell you about, because if we can spend an entire episode just talking about this. But she talks about narrators, and she says part of the reason why we narrate our stories here the way we do is because our stories come from an oral tradition. We are used to them shifting and changing with the tellings, and so we say حدثني أحد, somebody told me, right? And if we are able as writers to take that and put it into the output that we write, that would be amazing. But is that what's going to happen? I don't know. I think we need to wait like 10 years.
But I actually think in a way, instinctively, this almost happens already, because what you're discussing here relates very much to the section that Matthew Salesius talks about, which is where he describes Chinese American fiction characteristics, or Chinese fiction rather. Obviously, he again, another thing I appreciate in what he does is he always writes about stuff from a personal perspective. So he focuses on Chinese because he's an Asian American author, and that's his particular focus of interest. But when he was describing a study done by another academic, I think,
yes,
right, literature academic, yes, yeah, and he lists, I think, 10 characteristics of Chinese fiction that distinguish it.
That was my favorite part of the whole book.
Yeah, I love that. And also, I found that the characteristics that he described of Chinese fiction were very similar to a lot of fiction that I read from the Middle East. So an example is where he mentions one striking feature is the reliance on multiple points of view or multiple unreliable narrators, which is definitely something I've seen in a lot of Middle Eastern fiction, and alongside episodic stories, or what they call nesting, where you put a story within a story, which dates actually back to 1001 Nights, which is like seen as the original, the original nesting or story within a story structure. And I can think of examples of like Rafiq Shami, who's a Syrian author who writes in that structure, where what he describes it as kaleidoscopic.
The thing I noticed is the use of gossip.
I love that.
I remember this. I can't even remember the name of the book now, but when I was in school, they gave us this book of Lebanese, I think, short stories, and one really stood out to me. It was called either Tarbouche or Al-Umda or something like this, and it was basically these guys sitting.
Are you just naming Lebanese restaurants?
No, sorry. It's what I remember.
Are you
okay?
hungry? No, I'm kidding. Sorry.
But it's this guy sitting at a coffee shop.
Yeah.
And while he's sitting there, a man shows up looking like a mayor. He sits there and he puts his legs up on the table and he's like, "Get me a coffee," or whatever. And so the waiter comes in, he gets him his coffee, and then he goes and he starts talking to the main character and he says, "You know what, this guy, he's actually really poor, and let me tell you his story now." And I noticed this multiple times. The main character and the narrator sit together, they point towards somebody and they gossip about him.
Yes, yes.
And that's something that I've noticed.
Yeah, I've seen that in Orhan Pamuk, who we read one of his, well, that was more of a biography, but in one of his books, My Name is Red, it's all about a mystery of the death of a miniaturist in the royal court in the Ottoman Empire, and it's every chapter is told from the different point of view, and they're not necessarily all human. Like the first chapter is literally told from the perspective of the color red, which was and that's a perfect example of cultural significance playing a role, because the color red in the Ottoman history was a royal color, and not many people were allowed to use it. It was very expensive, and it was exclusive to the elite, kind of.
Oh, so it's similar to, apparently, in the feudal system in Europe, purple
Exactly.
was the same way. Yeah.
Exactly. So, if this was written by a British author, they might have called it My Name is Purple, and people in Europe would have understood the references, But the point is, one chapter was written by the color red, one chapter was written by a street dog, one chapter was written by, a petty, thief or whatever.
Yeah.
And, you piece the story together through all of these different narratives, some of them reliable, some of them unreliable. There's gossip, there's different forms of narration. It's really dynamic, and what Matthew Salesses describes as kaleidoscopic, I used to describe as a mosaic. I always had that image, that adjective in my mind whenever I read a lot of Middle Eastern fiction, is mosaic. And it actually, funnily enough, when I read this section from Matthew Salesses, I was like, oh my God, it's the same thing.
Yeah. No, you're 100% right.
Yeah.
What would our takeaway be for readers?
I mean, there's so much to take away, I think. For readers, like, this really was one thing I took away from this.
Should they read this book?
I think the person who has, like, for a nerd like me, like someone who really loves to read and analyze books and really get to the, not everyone is going to be that interested in getting into that much depth. But it's kind of like the same for like a film nerd who wants to read books about how films are made.
Yeah.
For me, the knowing about the craft of writing helps me become a more discerning reader and a more thoughtful reader, and know what to pay attention to. Like, I don't want to waste my time reading a masterpiece and then focus on the likability of the character when that's not necessarily even something that anyone should aspire to or even look for.
Yeah, nowadays it's interesting rather than reliable.
Exactly.
Relatable.
Exactly. But and another thing as well, so I think it's for very avid readers who are really interested in literature. I think it's still useful for writers, no matter where they come from, because it asks a lot of questions. And there's a lot of techniques, which he mentions as well, which I think can be very helpful.
Yeah.
And actually, I thought this would probably be the most helpful for what we call genre fiction. But I'm starting to feel now that this distinction between genre fiction and literary fiction is a sort of elitist kind of distinction that doesn't necessarily need to be applied anymore, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I understand what you mean. I mean, man, I really like Terry Pratchett. During one of his interviews, Terry Pratchett was asked about why he chose fantasy, right? And he said, he says it in such an amazing way. I'm just going to say one line, basically. If you go back to the history of mankind, our oldest stories were told in caves around campfires, and they were about why thunder was made, and we made up gods about them. fantasy is the oldest genre. Right?
It is.
And
Yeah.
it's the one with the most truth hidden inside
Yeah.
of it. So yeah.
I totally agree, and I love, and this is the thing is like when I do end up reading fantasy or science fiction, which I have to admit is less often nowadays, not because I don't like it, but because of the emotional investment you have, or like intellectual investment you have to put into building the world itself in your head. I'm just a little bit lazy when it comes to that, but I'm doing it now. I'm reading a Court of Thorn and Roses, and yeah, so I'm investing. I'm investing now, but I do think this is helpful for genre writers because when he talks about things like structure and the relatability. Relatability. As soon as the section that he talks about how relatability isn't necessarily a goal of the writing, but it can be manipulated, and when he mentioned that, my immediate example that came to my mind was Gone Girl by Gillian Flynn. Or Gillian Flynn? Gillian, I guess.
I don't know how to pronounce it. No idea.
But it was perfect because for those who haven't read Gone Girl, it's about the story of a woman who disappeared and her husband is the prime suspect. And the story is being told through diary entries from a diary that the police found. So when you're starting off, you're reading these diary entries, which are supposedly from her point of view, telling her side of the story, or what she wants the implied reader to be, that side of the story.
Yeah.
And then there's a shift in the perspective. So in the beginning, we're relating to the character because she's likable, she's smart, she's nice, she loves her husband, and supposedly she's like madluma, like she's like been done an injustice by her husband who resents her for all of her success.
Sorry.
You know?
Sorry.
It's okay. You can be condescending towards her here.
No. I just like I sensed the comedic moment and I went for it. Sorry.
You can be skeptical of her because she doesn't come off so rosy in the end.
Yeah.
She actually is not a relatable character, and that's genius actually for the way Gillian Flynn wrote it, because she's likable and relatable in the beginning, and that's purposeful, and then it shifts when you get another form of narration that actually shows the other side of the story, and then you can poke holes in everything you just read and learned, and you start to not trust the narrator anymore. So what I like is that he just looks at everything in a way that makes everything open for discussion, even things which people say, oh, this shouldn't be looked at anymore, like relatability, likability, are all actually tools that can be used by an author. And I think that the best ways you can see that is in some types of genre fiction, like thrillers and fantasies and science fiction. And so, I don't know, I would say that for me, I benefited so much from this book. It helped me realize as well that I need to make more of an effort in understanding my own culture. Actually, that was the takeaway that I had for this book, is that I don't actually know a lot about Arab literary tradition.
Yeah.
I don't. And in order to be able to understand it, I need to just spend more time looking into that world.
True. No, you're 100% right. All my likes and dislikes aside, I understand, I recognize that this author knows more about the craft of writing than I do, right? Just like the part where he talks about structure, and just like in a minute, he makes up a story. He goes like, oh, what if the structure is like this, and then let's play with the structure in this way. And he makes a story that's like better than anything I've written in the past year. And I'm upset, but, I still think that this book is mainly aimed towards people who have a more vested interest in the craft, in the workshopping, and all of that.
Definitely.
And so for the reader, I would say maybe just listen to our podcast, enjoy this episode, and then take the author's main advice, which is read critically, understand that what you read comes from a culture, and try other cultures. I would argue that the best thing people can do in reading is to try and read widely and as deeply as possible if this is their hobby. Try like a fantasy from China and a mystery from Iran and perhaps a thriller from Africa, and just get all of that mixed up in your head, and I think you will start to appreciate stories way more than you do, and you will find out that there's a lot that you would have otherwise missed out on.
Yeah. And I think the best way to end this part is to quote Haruki Murakami, that if you only ever read what everyone else is reading, you'll only ever think what everyone else is thinking.
And then you're going to be boring. That's what's going to happen.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being such a good sport and joining us.
Thank you so much, Fatima. It's always nice to talk about books, and this was a fun one to talk about.
So let me know if you have anything new coming up, anything you want to share with the audience.
Well, I finally got around to doing something that I've been promising people I would do for the longest time now. Ever since I published my fantasy novel Sodom, people have been asking me about the publishing process. So just today I finished filming a video where I talk about it and a blog post on my website. So I hope this lets people know more about how they can publish books by themselves here in Oman. I have a bunch of stories coming up, and I am working on my next novel, Hazim. Hopefully it's going to come out at some point this year. And
Exciting.
That's it.
The Papercut Club is a member of the Oman FM podcast collective. You can find all of Oman FM's latest shows and updates on Instagram at omanfm.om. This episode was hosted by me, Fatma Makki, and edited and mixed by Abdullah Al-Mawari. You can find The Papercut Club on Instagram and TikTok at thepapercut.club, or you can visit our website at www.thepapercut.club. Thank you for listening and happy reading.
Paper Cut Club on Oman FM.